Now, if I may, I know, Bernie, that when you first started studying consciousness, that was not what a lot of the people in your field were doing. As a matter of fact, it was considered taboo in a way.
Oh, exactly. Yes.
So can you tell me how you got interested in studying human consciousness, and how did that bring you to coming up with the global workspace theory? And what is global workspace theory?
Okay. Basically, consciousness has never really left the natural psychology of everyday life, right? I mean, we talk about taking an aspirin for a headache, and that violates David Chalmers' favorite phrase about the heart problem, because after all, an aspirin is just a crystalline protein, and you pop it in your mouth, and then somehow this psychic event occurs, right? If you're lucky, your headache goes away. And that's the only way you know that in the old days, certainly, is there's a change in subjective experience. And of course, we know many, many, many everyday things that happen. You know, you're hungry, you eat something you like to eat, your hunger goes away. That's a subjective experience. So if you really look at the mythology that has arisen for weird reasons around the idea of having a gulf between subjective experience and the so-called objective world, which is basically the world that you can subjectively agree on with another subjective mind. So, yeah, when you look at that, then there seems to be a gap. But even Gustav Fechner, around 1800, was convinced that that was a solvable problem. It was not a metaphysical gap. And so we've gotten trapped in very ancient and very tricky word games, if I may say that. And I think it's a disaster. And the reason why I think it's a disaster, actually, is because there's so many ethical implications of realizing that, you know, the animals you work with in the laboratory are conscious. Your pet cat is conscious, and so on. It goes on and on and on. And of course, in cultures that
Bernie,
realize
I think this is a really important point in defining consciousness, right? That it sounds like you're saying pretty clearly that you don't consider consciousness to be necessarily a human-only construct. And I think that that's, or a human-only experience. And I think just to give our listeners like a little bit of context, you know, researchers and philosophers have been debating the nature and origins of consciousness for centuries. And so there are a lot of different theories about what consciousness is and what creates it, and whether that's uniquely human, whether it's spiritual, whether it's physical. So one of Bernie's major contributions to the science of consciousness is the global workspace theory, which I think we'll sometimes refer to as GWT. And in the most basic terms, you know, my understanding is that GWT is a hypothesis about how conscious experience arises from the mind, and kind of more recently about how the brain might give rise to this conscious experience. Is that accurate, Bernie, in terms of what we're talking about it?
It is accurate, and please forgive my current obsession with the history of these ideas, because as I've gotten a better understanding, I think, of both the subjective and the brain basis of consciousness, I started to realize that Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, who is the charioteer, right, and who's conflicted, he's deeply conflicted about his obligations, whether he's supposed to kill his cousins or violate his warrior caste. And it's one of those Hamlet conflicts that populate the human literature and human folk tales, of course. And then the god comes down and says, okay, here's the solution to your dilemma. And that's Lord Krishna, and that's the punchline of the Bhagavad Gita. I'm not going to go into that. But that charioteer is a metaphor for consciousness and especially decision-making, because here's facing a dilemma. You know, where's he going to whip his horses into going? Sitting on this big chariot with the bronze and all that fabulous stuff. Anyway, so that's a
actually maybe we
that's
can
a metaphor for consciousness. And pardon me, I'm just going to say that it's also a global workspace metaphor.
Exactly.
Okay? Because he's getting all kinds of information, and he's got stuff from memory and stuff from his mentors who told him that he has to go into battle and risk his own life in order to have an honorable battle with the other warriors and so on. So he's got his own ethics that's been taught to him, and that stuff comes to his mind, and he can no longer do certain things because he's been taught. Right.
So when I first learned about global workspace theory, and I think that this ties into a metaphor, I learned, back to the Arjuna metaphor, I first learned about global workspace theory using your spotlight metaphor, right? The spotlight of attention. So for the listeners, this global workspace theory, at least for me, when I was first in grad school, was taught as there's the mind, right? The theater of the mind, and most of the theater is in the dark. And there is a spotlight, and the spotlight of attention can shine light anywhere in the mind. And that area of the mind that is illuminated, that area of this dark theater that is illuminated, that is what is our inner conscious awareness. And so there's this directed movement of our consciousness. So at any moment, only a small part of the mind is illuminated. But like this metaphor you're just describing, where he can kind of go into battle, or he can choose his direction, the spotlight can move into different spots of our mind and bring that into conscious awareness. Is that still, before we get into the brain science, just conceptually a fair way?
Conceptually it's almost right. And the reason why I say it's almost right is that I've always been troubled by the difference between voluntary attention and involuntary attention. Because a lot of the time, of course, if you're 3 years old, your little brother comes up to you and says, boo. And it's involuntary, you're scared or you're playful, whatever. But it's not your choice to pay attention to boo. It is imposed upon you. And that implies that there have to be selective mechanisms operating unconsciously prior to that moment that bring, that obnoxious little brother, getting right in your face and saying boo, that bring that to mind as a high priority thing. So there's a lot of unconscious control of access to consciousness. So that, and the idea, of course, that attention is a selective and directive thing, while consciousness just is. That's a poor way of saying it, but I think it makes the point. Consciousness, in a sense, is thrust upon us. We can do things to avoid it, but as an innocent baby, we don't have that much control over what becomes conscious. We need to pee, and we just do it. And consciousness is part of that process, I believe. So yes, go ahead.
Well, then kind of tying that back to the metaphor, I kind of hear you saying that maybe there are two questions to answer, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the metaphoric terms, there's what is the spotlight? Like what is this light that's shining down and illuminating part of the stage? So that might be like the what is consciousness question. But then there's also the question of what's moving that spotlight. How does it get moved to different parts of the mind? And those may or may not be the same thing, or are they one thing? What is your perception of that?
I think it's a whole swarm of things, and partly, of course, is that we do have some voluntary control, and as we get older from infancy, we gain more voluntary control over our ability to pay attention to things. About the famous Walter Mischel candy test for young children, where they're given marshmallows, I guess, right? And now you can get some more marshmallows if you wait for 10 seconds, right? And so, and that turns out to be predictive of the development of voluntary attention later on in life. It's really, really important. And it's just so early. So that's another
control, or
Yes, executive control is the technical term, and it's the right term. Yes.
A lot of kids in that experiment, right, use different strategies to not look at the marshmallow, right? Like to deal with it. So, you know, some actually literally look away and kind of try to take the marshmallow perhaps out of their conscious awareness as a regulation strategy. So that I think is really interesting and how that ties back.